Get comfortable. Settle the pillow. Let your shoulders drop, and let the day you have been carrying slide off you for a while. Tonight we are going somewhere very particular, and it is going to take us a long time to get through it, which is exactly what you want when you are trying to fall asleep. There is no hurry in anything that follows. We have a whole season ahead of us, and we are going to live it slowly, 1 week at a time. Here is where we are going. You are about to become a young woman of great fortune in London in the spring of the year 1815. And you are about to be launched into what everyone around you politely calls society and privately calls the marriage market. You have money, a great deal of it, and you are going to spend the next several months being looked at, assessed, weighed and priced in the most gracious and beautifully dressed way imaginable. Now, you have probably pictured this already. You have seen the version with the candlelit ballroom and the string quartet, the young woman in white gliding across the floor, while a handsome stranger watches her from across the room, and everything smells of beeswax and hothouse flowers. You have seen her laughing behind a fan. You have seen the whole thing rendered as a kind of glittering romance, a few months of dancing and flirtation before the right man appears, and the story ends. That is not who you are about to become tonight. Or rather, that is the surface of who you are about to become, the part that was meant to be seen. Underneath it is something far more interesting and far more like work, because a fashionable season was not a holiday. It was a campaign. It had a budget, a calendar, a set of rules more rigid than anything in an army manual, and a single, enormous, unspoken objective, which everyone understood, and almost no one said aloud. You were there to be married, and married well, and the entire machinery of your family, your money, and your own carefully trained body and mind was pointed at that one outcome for months on end. So, if you like, before we begin, leave a comment telling me which era you would least like to be launched into society in, and subscribe if you would like to spend more nights like this one, somewhere quiet and long ago. And then let the room go soft, and let us go back together to a tall house on a good street, and a trunk being carried up the stairs, and the very beginning of your season. It is the middle of February, and you have just arrived in London. The house is not yours. That is the first thing to understand. Your family has taken it for the season, the way nearly everyone of your rank did, rented for a few months at what would strike you as an astonishing sum. A furnished townhouse in a fashionable quarter with a good address that could be spoken aloud without embarrassment. The address matters as much as the house. To say that you were in Mayfair, or in one of the good squares nearby, was to say something about yourself before anyone had met you. A house on the wrong street could quietly undo a great deal of what your fortune was meant to buy. You come in from the carriage stiff and cold, because the roads from the country have been long and hard, and only just passable now that the worst of the winter is over. That timing is not an accident. Society came to London when Parliament did, and Parliament opened its new session in the late winter, and so the great families followed, arriving through February, settling their households, and waiting for the city to fill. To arrive too early was to sit in a half-empty town. To arrive too late was to have missed things. There was a right moment, as there was a right moment for nearly everything. And part of what you are learning this season is how to feel where those right moments are. The house smells faintly of other people. Rented furniture, rented curtains, a fire that someone else's servants laid in a grate you have never seen before. Somewhere below you, in the kitchen and the scullery, the household is already coming to life, because a house like this cannot run on the servants you brought with you from the country. Most families travelled with only a few of their own people and hired the rest in London, so that half the faces below stairs are strangers to you, taken on for the season and let go at the end of it. You will never learn most of their names. They will know a great deal about you. You are somewhere near 18 years old. Perhaps 17, perhaps 19, but young, in that narrow window when a girl was considered ready to be brought out. Your mother, or an aunt, or some married female relation of unimpeachable standing, is with you, because you cannot do any of this alone, and your fortune, the thing that will shape every single day of the months ahead, sits somewhere in the background of every conversation. Never mentioned directly, always precisely known. Let us stop on that word, fortune, because this is already the first thing most people misunderstand about a young heiress in a season like this one. Your money was not really yours. You held it the way you might hold a candle in a crowded room, responsible for it, able to be blamed if it went out, but not truly free to do with it as you pleased. In the law of the time, an unmarried woman could own property in her own name. But the moment she married, nearly everything she had passed into the control of her husband, unless her family had gone to considerable trouble and expense beforehand to prevent it. This was the doctrine that governed married women's property, and it meant that your fortune was less a possession than a promise. It was the thing you brought to a marriage, the thing that made you worth pursuing, and the thing you would very largely hand over the moment the pursuit succeeded. So understand what the season actually was underneath the music. It was the process by which a large sum of money, attached to a young woman, was introduced to the men who might wish to attach themselves to it, under conditions so heavily supervised, so ringed about with chaperones and rules and ritual, that nothing improper could occur, and no mistake could easily be made. The gowns, the dancing, the flowers, the careful conversation, all of it was the courteous surface of a negotiation about property and blood and family standing. You were the center of that negotiation. You were also, in a sense, its subject, the thing being negotiated over. Both of those were true at once, and the whole art of surviving a season with your dignity intact was learning to be both without letting the strain of it show on your face. We have months ahead of us. The presentation at court, the first great ball, the mornings that begin with visiting cards and end with a change of gown, the afternoons in the park where being seen was itself a kind of labor, the suppers, the operas, the endless small tests you did not know were tests, until you had already passed or failed them. We are going to move through all of it slowly, the way you would have lived it. And by the end, you will understand this glittering thing from the inside, as a young woman living it would have understood it, which is to say, as something a great deal more demanding and a great deal more human than the romance ever admits. For now, though, you are simply tired and cold and standing in a house that is not yours, at the start of the most important few months of your young life. Let the trunk be carried up. Let the fire catch. There is a great deal to be done before the city even knows you have arrived. Before the gowns, before the presentation, before any of the visible machinery begins to turn, there is a strategy, and though no one will ever write it down or say it plainly, it governs everything. Your family has a plan for you, and the season is the execution of that plan. And it is worth understanding the plan before we watch it unfold, because otherwise the whole spring looks like a series of pretty accidents, rather than the deliberate campaign it actually was. Start with the word that describes the whole thing coming out. You are being brought out this season, and the phrase itself carries the meaning if you listen to it. You are being brought out of one state and into another, out of the schoolroom and the nursery, and the protected invisibility of childhood, and into society, into visibility, into the marriage market, all at once, in a single defined transition. Before you came out, you were a girl, kept largely at home, not seen at adult gatherings, not eligible, not yet a person society needed to take account of. After you came out, you were a young woman available to be courted, expected at the balls and dinners, on the market, on display. There was very little in between. The change was sharp and deliberate and public, and the season was the occasion of it. And the timing of it was a decision made by others, chiefly by your mother, or whichever woman held that role. To bring a girl out too early, before she was ready, before she could carry the demands of it, was a mistake. To leave her too long unbrought out was to waste her freshest, most marriageable years. Somewhere around 17 or 18 was usual. And choosing the moment, and choosing the season in which to make the great outlay and the great attempt, was the first strategic decision of the whole business, and it was not yours to make. Understand, then, what your mother actually was in all of this, because the romance tends to reduce her to a fussing background figure, and she was nothing of the kind. She was the general of your campaign. She had, very likely, come through her own season decades before, and knew the whole terrain from the inside. Every rule, every trap, every unspoken gradation of who mattered and why. It was she who would secure the introductions, cultivate the great hostesses, angle for the All-Max voucher, rid the field of eligible men, and steer you toward the promising ones, and away from the unsuitable, manage the correspondence, and the calls, and the endless small decisions about where you should be seen, and with whom. Her reputation, her connections, her skill at this game, were as much a part of your prospects as your fortune or your face. A young woman with a great fortune, but a mother who did not know how to place her, could stumble, while a girl with less money, but a brilliantly capable mother, could rise further than anyone expected. Much of what looks, in the story, like a young woman's own social triumph, was in fact her mother's generalship, exercised on her behalf, invisibly, from just outside the frame. And her mother had done the same for her, and she would one day do the same for a daughter of her own. This is worth pausing on, because it reveals something about how this world actually reproduced itself. The knowledge of how to run a season, how to place a daughter, how to read the market and work the connections, was passed down from woman to woman, mother to daughter, across generations. a whole body of hard, practical expertise that was never taught in any school and never written in any book, and was, nonetheless, one of the most valuable things a woman of this class possessed. It was women's knowledge about the one great arena women were permitted to run, and it was real and formidable, and it moved down the female line like an inheritance, alongside the jewels and the family names. So when you arrive in London in February, cold and tired and 18, you are not simply a girl about to have some exciting months. You are the object of a campaign that has been planned for you, funded at enormous cost, and is about to be conducted on your behalf by an experienced strategist who happens to be your mother, with a clear objective, a fixed timetable, and very high stakes. Your job, in a sense, is to be the campaign's instrument and its face, to learn quickly, to perform well, to make the most of the openings your mother creates, and, at the one moment that finally matters, to say yes or no to the outcome. All this effort has been pointed at. It is a strange position, to be at once the most important person in an enormous undertaking and one of the least in control of it. But it is your position, and the whole spring will be spent learning to occupy it well. Now the campaign begins. The trunk is upstairs. The fires are lit. Somewhere across the filling city, other mothers are planning other campaigns for other daughters, your rivals, though you have not met them yet. And the modistas are bracing for the rush, and the great hostesses are deciding whose spring they will make and whose they will quietly ignore. The season is about to open, and you, the instrument and the prize, and the person at the center of it all, are about to be brought out. The first weeks of a season were not about balls at all. They were about preparation, and preparation for a young woman in your position meant one thing above all others. It meant clothes. You wake, in these early days, later than you would have in the country, 8 o'clock, perhaps 9, in a room where the maid has already been in to see to the fire and draw back a little of the curtain. Breakfast comes lightly and often privately. A cup of tea and bread and butter, sometimes taken in your room, while the real business of the morning is decided elsewhere in the house. There is no rush yet. The city is still filling. But the clock has started, whether you feel it or not, and the most urgent task of these opening weeks is that you must be dressed. From nothing into a young woman, the whole of fashionable London would find it worth its while to look at. Consider what that actually required, because the scale of it is easy to miss when it is compressed into a single word like wardrobe. You did not simply need a few good gowns. You needed a costume for every part of every day, and every part of the day had its own dress, its own rules, its own name. There was the morning dress, plain and modest, worn at home in the earlier hours. There was the walking dress and the carriage dress for going out. There was the promenade dress for being seen in the park. There was the dinner gown, the evening gown, and above all the ball gown. And a young woman in the thick of a season could not simply wear the same ball gown to ball after ball, because the same people would see her in it, and would notice, and would remember. Then there were the riding habit, the pelisse and the spencer for warmth over all of it, the bonnets and the shawls and the muffs and the parasols as the season warmed, and gloves, always gloves, in quantities that would astonish you, because they soiled easily, and a lady's ungloved hand in the wrong setting was very nearly an indecency. This is worth slowing down for, because the numbers tell a story that the gowns themselves conceal. When historians reconstruct what a season actually cost a family, working from surviving household accounts and the letters of people who lived through it, the figure that comes back for a single young woman's single season is somewhere in the region of £900. Hold that number for a moment, because on its own it means nothing. Set it beside another. A comfortable country gentleman in a novel of the period, a man whose family lives well and worries about nothing, might have an income of £2,000 a year. A respectable family of the lesser gentry might make do on £500 a year. An entire household, servants and food and everything, on £500. And a labouring man, a farm worker with a wife and children, might see £15 in a year. 15. So a single girl's single season at £900 could cost more than a labouring family would earn in 60 years of work. That is the machine you have been placed at the centre of. That is what is being spent on gowns and gloves and a rented house on a good street to place you in front of the right men. And most of that £900 went on you. On your clothes, your presentation, the sheer physical apparatus of making you visible in the correct way. So you understand now why the dressmaker comes before the ball. The ball is the performance. These weeks are the building of the costume, and the costume is the largest single expense of the entire undertaking. So you go to the dressmaker. Or rather, more often, the dressmaker comes to you, or you go to her rooms and stand for a very long time while the real work is done around your body. The word people used was modiste for the fashionable dressmakers, the ones whose names carried weight, and getting an appointment with a sought-after modiste in the crowded early weeks of the season was itself a small campaign. She would have more custom than she could manage. Every family with a girl to bring out wanted her, all in the same short window. And a great deal depended on whether your mother had the standing, or the ready money, or the relationship to secure the good hours rather than the leftover ones. Stand still now, because this takes a while. You are measured. You are draped. Muslin and silk and fine cotton are held against you and taken away again. There are decisions being made above your head, between your mother and the modiste, about necklines and trains and trimmings, about what colours suit a girl in her first season, which is to say, about how to dress you so that you look expensively simple, because that was the taste of the moment. The high fashion of these years favoured a slender, high-waisted line, the gown falling from just beneath the bust in a long, clean column. Pale colours, white above all, for a young unmarried woman. Fine light fabrics that draped rather than structured. It looked effortless. It was anything but. The apparent simplicity of a good gown was the most expensive thing about it, because simplicity in cut leaves nowhere to hide a flaw, and every seam and every fall of fabric had to be exactly right. Think about what you are actually wearing, layer by layer, because the finished gown is only the top of it. Against your skin goes the shift, or chemise, a simple washable garment of linen or cotton, whose whole purpose is to sit between your body and the costly outer clothes and take the wear and the sweat, so that the gown itself is protected and need not be washed, because washing a fine gown could ruin it. Over the shift comes the stays, the stiffened supporting garment that gave the body of the period its shape, laced to hold you in the correct line. Over that, petticoats, one or more, giving the gown something to fall over. And only then the gown itself, the visible thing, the thing everyone would judge, getting into all of it, was not something a young woman could do alone, which is one of the quiet reasons a lady's maid was not a luxury, but a necessity. The clothes themselves required another human being to put them on. That maid, by the way, is a person, and your relationship with her is one of the strangest and most intimate of your life, though you may never have thought of it that way. She sees you undressed every day. She knows the true state of your linen and your skin and your temper before anyone else in the house. She dresses your hair, which in these years might be swept up with a few curls left loose about the face, and she does it well or badly, in ways that will be visible to the whole room tonight. She is, in a sense, the one who builds the version of you that the world sees, and she is paid perhaps £15 or £20 a year to do it, less than the cost of 2 or 3 of the gowns she is helping you into. You will go out tonight and be admired, and part of what is being admired is her work, and no one at the ball will ever know her name. Hold that thought. We will come back to it, because it sits underneath the whole glittering season, like a foundation under a house. For now the fittings go on, day after day, through these first weeks. Silk stockings that cost 12 shillings a pair, which sounds like nothing until you remember that a woolen pair cost 2 shillings and 6pence, so that the silk ones cost roughly 5 times as much for the single reason that they were finer and would be seen. Gloves at a few shillings the pair, bought many pairs at a time. Slippers so light they wore through in a few evenings of dancing. A fan, a reticule, the little drawstring bag that held the few things a lady carried, because the clean lines of the gowns left no room for pockets. Each item small, all of it together, enormous. And through all of this, remember, you are being taught, not in a schoolroom, that is finished, but constantly by the women around you, in 1,000 small corrections. Stand so. Hold your head so. This color, not that one. You do not choose your own clothes in any real sense. Not yet. You are being assembled by people older and more experienced than you into an object of a very particular kind. And the strange thing, the thing that is hard to hold in your mind all at once, is that this is being done to you and for you at the same time. It is a cage. It is also, genuinely, a gift, the most expensive care and attention your family will ever lavish on you. And both of those are true, and you feel both of them, sometimes in the same hour. And then, before any ball, before the season proper has truly begun, there is the presentation. For a young woman of your rank and fortune, being formally presented at court was the door through which you entered society, the official mark that you were no longer a child in the schoolroom, but a young woman out in the world, eligible, available, launched. Not every girl was presented. It required the right connections, a lady of suitable standing, already established at court to present you, and it required, once again, a great deal of money. But for a family with your fortune and your ambitions, it was very nearly obligatory, and so, some weeks into your time in London, you prepare to be taken before the Queen. The Queen, in this year, is Queen Charlotte, the wife of the old king, and it is she who holds the events at which young women were presented. They were called drawing rooms, which is a gentle and misleading name for something so formal and so frightening. They were held at one of the royal palaces, and they did not happen on a convenient schedule. A family hoping to present a daughter had to wait for one to be held and secure a place at it, and the uncertainty of the timing was one more thing to be managed and worried over in these opening weeks. The court had its own dress, and here is one of the great absurdities of the whole season, one that people at the time noticed and complained about, and obeyed anyway. Fashionable dress in these years, as we have seen, had moved to the high-waisted, slim, flowing line. But court dress had not moved with it. The court still demanded, at least for the lower part of the costume, the wide hooped skirts of an older generation, the great panniered shape that stood out from the hips. So a young woman being presented had to wear a gown that was fashionable and modern above the waist, and archaic and enormous below it, a costume that satisfied two entirely different decades of taste at once, and was, by most accounts, deeply uncomfortable and faintly ridiculous. You were also required to wear a train and a headdress of white ostrich feathers, tall plumes rising from your hair, which was the fixed and unbreakable rule of the Queen's drawing rooms. Feathers and a train, whatever else you wore. Consider the cost of this single garment, worn very possibly only once. A court gown, complete with all that went with it, the train, the feathers, the fan, the gloves, the shoes, the jewels a family might add, could run from something over £100 to £200, £300, even £500 and more, depending on the richness of the materials and the fame of the modiste. Gold and silver netting, real lace, seed pearls sewn on by hand, embroidery that took many pairs of hands many days to complete. A single dress for a single afternoon, that in most cases could never be worn in that form again, costing as much as a genteel family lived on for half a year or more, and it bought you, in the end, a few minutes in a crowded room and one deep curtsy before an elderly queen. But those few minutes mattered, so let us live them, because the presentation itself is a small ordeal that a young woman never forgot. You arrive at the palace and you wait. That is the first truth of it, the waiting. The drawing rooms were crowded, and the great families all came at once, and so you sit or stand for what feels like hours in your enormous, uncomfortable gown, in a press of other young women in their own enormous gowns, all of you nervous, all of you rehearsing. In your minds, the one thing you must not get wrong. The heat of the rooms, the crush of bodies, the weight of the train over your arm, the plumes trembling slightly above your head every time you move. And you wait. The one thing you must not get wrong is the curtsy. Not an ordinary curtsy, the full court curtsy, sinking very low, holding it, your back straight, your head correct, and then rising again smoothly without wobbling, without stumbling, without treading on your own train, all of it performed in front of the Queen and the assembled court in a silence that made every small sound enormous. Young women practiced this for weeks. There were people who taught it. And still the fear of it, of sinking down before the Queen, and then being unable to rise gracefully, of the whole room watching you falter, was one of the sharpest fears of a young woman's life to that point. When your moment comes at last, it is very quick. Your name, or rather the fact of you, is conveyed. You move forward. You perform the curtsy you have practiced until your knees ache. Perhaps you kiss the Queen's hand, or she yours, depending on your rank. And then, and this is the part no one warns you about clearly enough, you must withdraw, and you may not simply turn and walk away, because one did not turn one's back on the monarch. You have to leave the royal presence moving backward, managing that train, in that hooped gown, without looking behind you, until you are far enough away to turn. Servants were placed about the room to help guide young women out, to keep them from disaster. And most managed it, and a few did not, and the ones who did not were talked about. And then it is over. You are through the door. The thing you dreaded for weeks has taken a handful of minutes, and you are out the other side of it, launched, presented, official. Whatever else happens this season, you have done this. You have stood before the Queen and not disgraced yourself. And there is a particular quiet triumph in that, a steadiness that settles into you afterward, because you have passed the first and most formal test of the whole undertaking. Here is what is easy to miss about the presentation, standing at this distance from it. It looks, to us, like pure ceremony, a piece of pageantry with no purpose beyond itself. But it was doing real work. It was a form of certification. To be presented at court was to be vouched for, to have a lady of standing publicly stake her own reputation on your fitness to be received. It told everyone who mattered that you were the genuine article, that your family was what it claimed to be, that you could be safely admitted to the drawing rooms and ballrooms of the great. In a world without any of the documents and databases we use to establish who a person is, the presentation was how the highest level of society checked its own membership. You had been examined and passed. The door was open. And now the real season, the months of it, could begin. You go home from the palace exhausted, the feathers finally out of your hair, the great gown lifted off you by the maid, and you sleep, probably, better than you have in a week. Tomorrow, the visiting begins in earnest. Tomorrow, the cards start to arrive. The cards. If you want to understand how society actually functioned, day by day, beneath the balls and the grand set pieces, you have to understand the cards, because the whole enormous structure of who knew whom, and who could be introduced to whom, and who was rising, and who was falling, ran on small pieces of stiff paper carried from house to house. A visiting card was exactly that, a card printed or engraved with a name, left at a house to signify that a person had called. And an extraordinary amount of meaning was packed into the leaving and receiving of them. When you were new in town, or newly out, a great deal of your standing depended on who called on you, and whom you were permitted to call upon in return. A call, in this world, was not a casual thing. It was a formal social act, with rules attached to nearly every part of it. And learning those rules, quickly and without visible effort, was one of the first real tests of the season. Here is roughly how it worked, though the details varied, and the whole thing was a moving target that a clever young woman learned to read by feel. In the earlier part of the day, in the hours after the morning, proper but before dinner, ladies made their calls. A call was short, deliberately short, a quarter of an hour or so, sometimes less. You did not settle in. You arrived, you were shown up, You made pleasant conversation about nothing of any consequence, and you left. And the brevity was the point, because the call was not really about the conversation. It was about the fact of the call, the acknowledgement, the maintenance of the connection. To stay too long was to be a nuisance, and to reveal that you did not understand the game. To call too early in the day was to be uncouth. There was a right window, and inside that window there were finer gradations still, and the whole thing was a language you were expected to already be fluent in. When the lady of a house was not receiving, or was out, you left a card, and the card said, "I called. I did my part. The connection is maintained." There were even conventions about how the card was left, small folds and gestures that carried specific meanings, whether you had called in person or sent the card round, whether the call was for the lady of the house alone or for the whole family. It sounds absurdly elaborate, and it was, but it was doing something real. In a city that filled every spring with more important people than anyone could possibly keep track of by memory, the cards were a system of record. They were how society kept its own books. For you, newly presented, the arrival of cards was a daily verdict. Who had called signaled who had decided you were worth knowing. The great hostesses, the women whose invitations everyone wanted, the mothers of eligible sons, the arbiters whose approval could carry a girl, and whose coldness could quietly sink her, each of them leaving a card, or failing to, was a small piece of information about where you stood. You learned to read the salver of cards in the hall, the way a general reads a map. And your mother, or your aunt, read it with you. And there were mornings of quiet satisfaction and mornings of quiet worry, all of it conducted in the polite fiction that none of it mattered very much at all. This is the great effort that the romance never shows you, the sheer administrative labor of a season. Behind the girl, gliding across the ballroom, is a vast apparatus of correspondence and calls and careful bookkeeping. Invitations to be answered the same day they arrived, cards to be returned in the correct interval, a mental ledger of obligations and slights and connections that had to be kept current at all times. Much of this fell to the older women, the mothers and aunts and chaperones, who ran the campaign while the young woman was its face. But you were learning it too, absorbing it, because one day you would be the one running a season for a daughter of your own, and the knowledge had to be in you by then. And around all of this administration, the days themselves had their shape, and that shape was punishing in a way that is hard to appreciate until you count the changes of clothes. You woke and were dressed in a morning gown. Before going out to walk or call, you changed into a walking or carriage dress. If you went to the park in the fashionable hour, you might be in a promenade dress. You came home and changed into an afternoon gown, and in the evening you changed again into a dinner gown, or if there was a ball or the opera, into full evening dress, the grandest costume of the day. 4 changes of clothing, 5, sometimes more, every single day, each one requiring the maid, each one taking time, each one a small production. The reason for it was partly practical. Different activities genuinely suited different clothes. But it was mostly display. To dress correctly for every hour of the day was to demonstrate over and over that you had the wardrobe, the servants, and the knowledge to do so. It was wealth performed as routine. So a day in the middle of the season, once it was properly underway, might run something like this. A quiet, late start, breakfast lightly taken, the morning given to correspondence, to answering the invitations that had come, to the small management of the household in which you played a growing part. Then calls, made or received through the middle of the day, that careful traffic of short visits and left cards. In the afternoon, perhaps a visit to the shops or to the modiste again, because the wardrobe was never truly finished and always needed feeding. Then the park in the late afternoon for the promenade, which we will come to properly, because it deserves its own attention. Home to change. Dinner, which among the fashionable had crept later and later until it sat in the early evening. And then, most nights, out again, to a ball, a rout, a musical evening, the opera, whatever the great houses were offering that night, and often to more than one, moving from house to house late into the night, and then home, at last, in the small hours, to be undressed and to sleep, and to do the whole thing again the next day, for weeks and weeks and weeks. It is a mistake to think of this as leisure. It had the shape of pleasure, and there were real pleasures in it. But it was closer to a season of continuous, high-stakes work, performed in beautiful clothes, on very little sleep, under constant observation. And you were expected to make all of it look easy, to move through it as though it cost you nothing, because the appearance of effortlessness was itself part of what you were selling. The strain was not permitted to show. That, too, was a skill, and you were learning it, day by exhausting day. Now the first great ball. This is the thing you have been building toward, the thing the gowns were made for, and when the night finally comes, it arrives wrapped in more nervousness than pleasure, at least at first. The preparation begins in the afternoon, and it is a long one. You are bathed, or at least thoroughly washed, in an age when a full bath was an undertaking that servants carried up in cans of heated water. Your hair is dressed, which takes a long time and cannot be hurried, swept up and pinned and arranged with whatever ornament the occasion allowed for an unmarried girl, which meant nothing too rich, nothing that presumed too much. Flowers, perhaps, or a simple band. The great jewels stayed on the married women. A young woman, in her first season, was meant to shine by her freshness, not her diamonds, and to overdress was to make a serious mistake, to look as though you or your family were trying too hard, which was somehow worse than not trying at all. Then the gown. The best of your ball gowns, white or the palest of colours, the fine light fabric falling in that long clean line, and over it the shawl or wrap for the carriage, because the night is cold and the rooms will be hot. Gloves, long ones, drawn up the arm. The little fan, the lightest of slippers, the ones that will be ruined by morning. And then a last look in a glass at the assembled and expensive result, the version of you that has taken weeks and a small fortune to build, and that will now be sent out to be judged. You do not go alone. You never go alone. Somewhere very near you, all night, is your chaperone, your mother, or your aunt, or whichever married woman of good standing has charge of you. And her presence is not a formality. She is the guarantee of your respectability, the visible sign that you are properly protected and cannot be approached improperly, and her eyes are on you for the entire evening. A young unmarried woman was never, at any moment of a public evening, to be truly alone with a man. She could dance with him in full view of the room. She could converse with him, within earshot of others. But the whole architecture of the evening was built to make sure that nothing more private than that could occur, and the chaperone was the keystone of that architecture. This can sound to us like suffocation, and in some ways it was. But it is worth understanding what it was protecting, because it was not really your comfort. It was your value. A young woman's reputation was, in the cold logic of the marriage market, part of what she brought to a marriage, as real an asset as her fortune. And a reputation once damaged could not be repaired. The chaperone guarded the asset. You arrive. You are announced. You come up the stairs into the heat and light and noise of a great house given over entirely to the evening. The rooms banked with candles and flowers, the crush of people, the sound of the musicians already playing somewhere ahead of you. And here is the first thing the romance gets wrong about a ball. It was often unpleasantly crowded, hot, loud, and airless. A great squeeze of bodies in rooms never quite large enough, and to be admired at a fashionable crush was partly to survive it. The most sought-after evenings were the most crowded ones, precisely because everyone wanted to be there. And so the mark of a successful ball was a degree of discomfort that we would find hard to bear. The dancing is the heart of it, and the dancing had rules, layers of them, that governed the single most important interaction of your evening. You could not simply dance with whom you liked. A gentleman had to be introduced to you before he could ask you to dance, and the introduction itself had to come from someone with the standing to make it, often one of the hostesses or a mutual connection who could vouch for the man. This was another quiet piece of protection and another quiet piece of gatekeeping. It meant that the men who reached you had already been filtered, judged suitable to be presented to a young woman of your fortune. And when a man had been introduced and asked you to dance, and you accepted, the two of you moved out onto the floor and did the one thing the whole evening was arranged to permit, which was to spend a set of dances more or less in each other's company, talking in the only halfway private conversation the rules allowed. That is what the dancing was for. Not romance in the way we mean it, or not only that. It was the sanctioned space in which a young woman and a man could actually speak to each other, take each other's measure, discover whether there was anything there beyond the fortune and the family and the arrangement. A set of country dances could last a good while, long enough for real conversation, and a great deal was decided in those conversations, or begun there, or quietly ended, who a young woman danced with, and how often, and whether she danced twice with the same man, which was noticed, which meant something. All of it was watched by the whole room and read like a text. To dance twice with one gentleman signaled a particular interest. To dance a third time was very nearly a declaration, and could not be done lightly. There was one dance that hung over these years like a small scandal, and that was the waltz. The waltz was new, and it was different from everything that came before it, because in the waltz, a man held a woman, his hand at her back, the two of them turning together, close, for the length of the dance. To a society built entirely on keeping unmarried men and women at a careful distance, this was genuinely shocking, and there were people who thought it improper, indecent. a corruption blown in from the continent. In these very years, it was fighting its way into acceptance, and whether a young woman could waltz at all was not entirely her own decision. At the most exclusive assemblies, a girl was not supposed to waltz until one of the great patronesses had, in effect, given her permission, marking her as ready for it. So even the most modern and thrilling thing in the room was fenced about with rules, permission, gatekeeping. Nothing, not even a dance, was allowed to be simply free. And through all of it, you are performing. That is the exhausting truth under the pleasure of the night. Every moment you are visible. You are being assessed by the men who might court you, by the mothers weighing you against their sons, by the other young women measuring themselves against you, by the hostesses deciding whether you were an ornament to their evening or a disappointment. You must appear to be enjoying yourself lightly, gracefully. Whatever you actually feel, you must converse well, but not too cleverly, because too much wit in a young woman could unsettle as easily as it charmed. You must dance well. You must not seem to want any of it too much. The whole thing is a performance of effortless charm laid over a foundation of relentless calculation. And the young women who succeeded were very often the ones who understood that it was a performance and gave it night after night without ever letting the audience see the effort underneath. You go home from your first ball somewhere in the small hours, your feet ruined, your head ringing with music and noise, your mother beside you in the dark of the carriage, already reviewing the evening, who you danced with, who noticed you, what was said. And you are tired in a way that is new to you, a bone-deep social exhaustion, and you understand, perhaps for the first time fully, that this is not going to be a few charming evenings. This is going to be months of this, and it has only just begun. There was one place, above all others, where the whole logic of the season showed itself most nakedly, and that place was a set of assembly rooms on a street in the fashionable heart of London, known to everyone simply as Almack's. If you understand Almack's, you understand the season, because Almack's was the season distilled down to its purest and most ruthless form. On its face, it was nothing very grand. Almack's was a suite of rooms, and once a week during the season, on a Wednesday evening, there was a ball there. That was all. The refreshments were famously poor, weak lemonade, tea, thin bread and butter, dry cake. There was no wine, no supper worth the name, none of the lavishness of a great private ball. If you judged Almack's by what it offered, it was one of the plainest entertainments in London. And it was, without any question, the most exclusive and most desperately sought-after place in the entire fashionable world. Families schemed for a season. Women humbled themselves. Reputations rose and fell, all over the question of whether one could get into a plain set of rooms for weak lemonade on a Wednesday night. The reason was the vouchers, and the women who controlled them. You could not simply buy your way into Almack's. To attend, you needed a voucher, and vouchers were granted, personally, by a small group of aristocratic women known as the Lady Patronesses. There were only a handful of them, the great ladies of the day, women like Lady Jersey, Lady Cowper, Lady Castlereagh, the Countess Leven, Princess Esterhazy, and a few others, and together they held a power that is genuinely hard to describe to a modern person, because we have nothing quite like it. They decided who was in and who was out. Not who was rich, because plenty of rich people were refused. Not who was well-born, because even a duke's daughter could be kept out if the patronesses chose. They decided who belonged by their own private judgment, and their decision was very nearly beyond appeal. Every week during the season, the patronesses met and went through the applications, the requests for vouchers, and sorted them, the accepted and the refused. And to be refused was a public wound. It was not merely that you missed a Wednesday ball with bad refreshments. It was that everyone knew you had been refused, and being refused by Almack's was a statement, made by the highest arbiters of society, that you did not quite belong. To lose a voucher you had once held was worse still, a fall from grace visible to the whole world. And so people who could face down almost anything, wealthy, powerful, well-connected people, were reduced to real anxiety over the goodwill of these few women, because these few women controlled the one door that could not be forced. A voucher, once granted, let you buy a subscription for the season, at a price of about 10 guineas, and a guinea, you should understand, was slightly more than £1. So this was real money, though for the families who cared about Almack's, the cost was never the point. The point was the permission. The point was that you had been judged and admitted. For a young woman being brought out, a voucher to Almack's was one of the great prizes of the season, because it placed her unmistakably among the accepted. It said that the highest women in society had looked at her family, her connections, her conduct, and found them sufficient. And within those plain rooms, under the eyes of the patronesses, the marriage market did its most concentrated work, because the young men who mattered were there too, filtered through the same gate, so that a girl at Almack's could be reasonably sure that any man she met there had already been judged worthy of the same room. The rules inside were strict to the point of severity, and they were enforced without mercy, because their very strictness was part of what the place was selling. The doors closed at 11 o'clock, and they closed absolutely. There is a famous story, told and retold because it captured the thing so perfectly, of a great duke, one of the most celebrated men in the country, arriving a few minutes after 11 and being turned away at the door, refused entry, because the rule was the rule, and even he could not bend it. Whether every detail of the story is exactly true almost does not matter. It was believed and it was told because it expressed a real truth about the place, which was that inside those rooms the patroness's authority was total, and no rank, no fame, no fortune stood above it. Think about what these women had actually built. They had taken a plain set of rooms and a weak glass of lemonade, and purely through the exercise of exclusion, turned it into the most valuable social address in the country. They created value out of refusal. The worse the refreshments and the stricter the rules, the more it proved that people came for one reason only, to be among the admitted. And every person refused at the door made the admission of everyone inside worth more. It is one of the purest examples you will ever find of how social power actually works, how belonging is manufactured by the drawing of a line, and how the people who control the line hold a power out of all proportion to anything they actually own or produce. And here is the part that ought to stay with you. the part that connects Almax back to everything else we have seen this season. That power, that genuine, formidable, society-shaping power, was held by women in an age when women could not vote, could not sit in Parliament, lost control of their own property upon marriage, and were told in 100 ways that the public world was not theirs. A handful of aristocratic women wielded, through Almax and the wider machinery of the social season, a real and feared authority over the fortunes of families. The season was one of the very few arenas in which women held open, acknowledged power, and they held it precisely because the season was understood as women's business, the management of marriage and connection and reputation, the domestic and the social rather than the political. It was power inside a cage, power over a world that men had decided was beneath their direct attention. And the women who held it fiercely, because it was very nearly the only public power available to them. So when you go to Almax, as you will this season, having secured your voucher after who knows how much quiet effort on your mother's part, you are not just going to a dull ball with bad lemonade. You are entering the single clearest expression of everything the season was. A place where belonging was everything, where a few women decided the fates of many, and where the whole strange machinery of exclusion and value and female power ran in plain sight, under the candles, to the sound of a country dance. You dance. You are watched. You belong tonight, and you feel the specific relief of that belonging. And underneath it, if you are paying attention, you feel how conditional it is, how it could be taken away, how it rests entirely on the continued goodwill of women who owe you nothing. By now the season has settled into its full stride, and the days have taken on the strange doubled quality that is so hard to explain to anyone who has not lived it. On the surface, an endless round of pleasure. Underneath, an endless round of work. Let us spend a while in the middle of it, in the ordinary machinery of a fashionable spring, because the great set pieces, the presentation, the first ball, Almax, are only the peaks, and most of a season was lived in the long stretches between them. Take the promenade in the park in the late afternoon, because nothing shows the doubled quality better. In the fashionable hour, which was not really an hour, but stretched across the later part of the afternoon into early evening, the great open space of Hyde Park filled with the members of society, on foot, on horseback, and in their carriages, moving slowly up and down the fashionable avenue, seeing and being seen. To a stranger, it would have looked like a crowd of idle, wealthy people taking the air. It was nothing so simple. The promenade was a daily performance of belonging, and attendance at it was very nearly compulsory for anyone who wished to be counted among the fashionable. To be seen there, dressed correctly, in the right company, was to reassert every single day that you were part of this world. To be absent too often was to risk being forgotten, and to be forgotten was, in this world, a kind of small death. So you go, in your carriage or on foot with your chaperone, in the promenade dress that exists for exactly this purpose, and you move at a walking pace through a slow river of the most important people in the country, and you bow and you are bowed too. You exchange a few words here, a nod there. You note who is speaking to whom, who is riding beside whom, whose carriage has stopped alongside whose. It is intelligence gathering. It is the maintenance of the network. It is the place where the connections made in the ballrooms were kept alive in daylight, where a courtship that had begun the night before could be gently advanced by the simple fact of two families' carriages happening to pause together, in full view, respectably, for a few minutes' conversation. A great deal of the real work of matching and connecting happened not at the grand balls, but here, in these slow afternoons, in the open air, under everyone's eyes. And there was the opera and the theatre, which served much the same function dressed up as entertainment. A fashionable family did not simply go to hear the music. They took a box, or sat in one belonging to friends, and the box was as much a stage as the stage itself. From your box, you could see the whole house, and the whole house could see you. And a great part of the evening was spent observing who was in which box, who visited whom between the acts, who was displaying which daughter to which advantage. The performance on the stage was almost incidental to the performance in the seats. For a young woman being brought out, an evening at the opera was another occasion to be placed on view, beautifully arranged in a box, where the right people would see her. And the music, whatever it was, went on somewhere in the background of the evening's real business. Then there were the roots, and here the doubled quality reached a kind of absurd extreme. A rout was an evening party whose entire purpose was to be crowded. The hostess invited far more people than her rooms could comfortably hold, and success was measured precisely by the crush, by how impossibly packed the house became, by how many carriages blocked the street outside. There was often little to do at a rout. No real dancing, no proper supper, sometimes hardly any conversation possible in the press of bodies. People arrived, forced their way through the crowd, were seen to have been there, and left, sometimes moving on to 2 or 3 more routes the same night. The whole thing sounds pointless, and in a sense it was, but the pointlessness was the point. To have been squeezed half to death at the most fashionable crush of the night was to have been where one ought to be. The pleasure, as one sharp observer of the time noticed, was almost entirely in the anticipation of the next day's gossip, in being able to say, and to have others say of you, that you had been there. Do you see the shape of it now? Almost nothing in the season existed for its own sake. The park was not for air, the opera was not for music, the rout was not for pleasure. Every one of these was an occasion for display, for the maintenance of position, for the slow, patient advancement of the season's real business, which was always, underneath everything, the making of good marriages and the keeping of good standing. And you, the young woman at the center of your family's hopes, were on duty at all of it. There was no evening off. To withdraw, to rest, to simply not appear, was to lose ground, and ground lost in a season was hard to recover because the season was short, and the competition was real, and the other family's daughters were out there every night doing the work. The competition deserves an honest word, because the romance likes to pretend it was not there, and it was there constantly under the surface courtesy. You were not the only heiress in London that spring. You were not the only beautiful girl, or the only clever one, or the only one with a great fortune and an ambitious mother. Every young woman brought out that season was, in a sense, your rival, competing for the same limited number of truly eligible men. And everyone knew it, and everyone was far too well bred to say it. The friendships between young women in a season were real, often, and also shadowed by this, by the knowledge that you were all in the same market at the same time. Some of the sharpest social skill a young woman learned was how to be genuinely warm with the very girls she was competing against, how to hold friendship and rivalry in the same hand without letting either one show too much. It was again a performance, and again, the ones who did it best were the ones who understood exactly what they were doing. And the strain of all this, the sheer unrelenting quantity of it, told on the body. Consider the actual physical toll of a full season, which the paintings never show. You are out most nights until 2, 3, 4 in the morning. You slept late, but never enough. You ate at strange hours, rich food at fashionable dinners that sat later and later in the evening. You were laced into stays and stood and danced for hours. You were, for months, chronically short of sleep, overstimulated, and permanently on display, never able to fully relax, because there was almost no moment of the public day when you were not potentially being observed. Young women became genuinely ill from seasons. They wore themselves down. And they were expected, through all of it, to look fresh and bright and untroubled, to carry the exhaustion invisibly, because the whole enterprise depended on the appearance that all of this cost you nothing at all. This is the great labor that hides inside the word season, and it is a labor that was almost never named, because to name it would have been to admit that the leisured life was not leisured, that the young woman gliding through her spring was in fact working as hard, in her way, as the maid who dressed her. The difference was that the maid's work was called work, and paid poorly, and the young woman's work was called pleasure, and cost her family a fortune, and neither of them, in the end, quite owned the results of what they did. We have spent a great deal of the evening out, at balls and operas and crushes, but a great deal of the season was also spent at the dinner table, and the fashionable dinner deserves its own attention, because it was one of the most demanding social occasions of all, and one where a young woman's standing could be quietly made or damaged over the course of a few hours and a great many courses. The first thing to understand is that dinner among the fashionable had drifted extraordinarily late by these years. Where an earlier generation, and the common people throughout, took their main meal in the middle of the day, high society had pushed it back and back until it sat in the early evening, and would go on being pushed later in the decades to come. To dine late was itself a mark of fashion, a way of signaling that you did not rise at dawn to work, that your day was arranged around leisure and society rather than labor. The hour of your dinner announced your class as clearly as your address did. So you dined late, and the meal that had once been the practical center of the day became instead the ceremonial center of the evening, the occasion around which an entire social event was built. And it was an event. A formal dinner at a great house was a production of real complexity, and the woman who hosted it, the mistress of the house, was its director, though she would never have been described in such active terms. The planning fell to her. The menus, the ordering of the courses, the arrangement of the guests around the table, which mattered enormously, because who sat next to whom was a statement about rank and intention that everyone at the table would read. A guest placed too low for their standing was insulted. A young woman placed beside a particular gentleman was being gently displayed to him, and both of them and everyone else understood it. The seating of a dinner was a small piece of social engineering, worked out in advance with great care, and getting it wrong could give offense that lingered for years. The food itself came in a manner that would seem strange to us, in great numbers of dishes set out together, rather than brought one plate at a time. A course, in this system, was not a single dish, but a whole array of them, set on the table at once, savory and sweet together, and the diners helped themselves and one another from whatever was within reach, which is one reason your neighbor at table mattered so much, because he was the person who would serve you and converse with you throughout. Then the whole array would be cleared, and a second course, another full array, set out in its place, meats and fish and fowl, pies and vegetables, jellies and creams, and elaborate sugar-work. The sheer quantity of it far beyond what anyone could eat, because abundance was part of the display. A fashionable table was meant to overwhelm, to demonstrate the wealth and the kitchen and the staff that could produce such a thing. Much of it went back down to the kitchen barely touched, to be eaten by the servants or sold on, and the waste was not an accident but a message. Think of the labor behind that table, because it connects to everything we have already seen below stairs. Every one of those dishes was made by hand, in a hot kitchen, by a cook and her helpers who had been working since early morning to produce a meal they would not sit down to. The elaborate sugar work alone could take a skilled confectioner hours. The whole spectacle of effortless abundance in the dining room rested on a great deal of very effortful, very hot, very hidden work one floor below, performed by people whose names the guests would never know, and whose faces they would barely register as the dishes appeared and vanished. It is the same pattern we keep finding. The ease above built on the labor below, and the dinner table displayed it more literally than almost anything else, because the distance from the kitchen to the dining room was a distance of only a few feet and an entire social universe. For you, the young woman being brought out, a dinner was a particular kind of test, more searching in some ways than a ball, because it lasted longer and allowed nowhere to hide. At a ball, you could dance and be in motion, and let the movement carry you. At a dinner, you were seated for hours, beside whoever had been chosen for you, and you had to converse, well, sustainedly, without saying anything foolish or anything too clever, without appearing bored, without appearing to try too hard, through course after course after course. You had to know how to eat gracefully in company, which was its own small art. You had to follow the conversation of the whole table, know when to speak and when to listen, defer correctly to those above you, be gracious to those below. And you had to do all of this while being watched, always being watched, by the hostess assessing you, by the gentleman beside you weighing you, by the other guests forming their opinions. A young woman who shone at a good dinner, who was found to be pleasant and well-informed, and easy without being forward, did herself a great deal of good, and the news of it travelled. A young woman who faltered, who was awkward or dull, or said the wrong thing, did herself harm that no amount of beauty in the ballroom could quite undo. There is a household economics lurking underneath all of this too, worth a moment, because the fashionable dinner was not only a social event, but a considerable expense, and the running of a great London household through a season was a feat of management that fell largely to women. The food, the wine, the extra staff hired for the evening, the candles, which were themselves a real cost, good wax candles being expensive, and a well-lit house burning through a startling number of them. All of it added up, week after week, on top of the wardrobe and the house, and everything else. The mistress of the house kept the accounts, or oversaw those who kept them, managed the tradespeople, settled the bills, and did the constant, quiet arithmetic of living expensively without living recklessly. This was real administrative and financial work, and a woman who did it well kept a great establishment running smoothly on a scale that would daunt many people, and a woman who did it badly could bring real trouble on a family. It was, once again, work that was not called work, skill that was not called skill, performed by women whose whole world insisted they did nothing of consequence. So the dinner, like everything else in the season, turns out to be more than it appears. Not merely a meal, not merely a pleasure, but an occasion of display, a test of accomplishment, a feat of management, and a small stage on which the whole drama of rank and marriage and money played out in miniature, over several hours and many dishes, while the people who had made it possible stayed carefully out of sight below. Somewhere in the thick of the season, if things go as your family hopes, a particular man begins to appear more often than the others. It happens gradually, in the language of a world that never says anything directly. He is introduced to you at a ball, and then he is at the next ball too, and he asks you to dance, and then at the ball after that he asks you again, and it is noticed. His mother calls on yours. Your family's carriages pause together at the promenade. He is at the opera, in a box from which he can see yours. None of this is spoken of as courtship, not yet, but everyone involved understands perfectly what is happening. And the very indirectness of it is part of how it was done. Let us slow down and look hard at what courtship actually was for a young woman of your fortune, because this is where the romance and the reality diverge most sharply, and where the whole season reveals what it had been for all along. A courtship in this world was not primarily a love story. It might contain one. Real affection did grow sometimes between people thrown together by the season's machinery, and a marriage that began as an arrangement could become, over years, something warmer. But that was the hoped-for bonus, not the foundation. The foundation was a match, and a match was, at its heart, a transaction between two families, concerning property, blood, and standing, in which the two young people at the center were the occasion, but very often not the decisive parties. Consider who actually decided. In theory, and increasingly in practice as the years went on, a young woman had some say. She could refuse. The brutal old world of the purely arranged marriage, in which a girl was simply handed over regardless of her wishes, was softening, and by these years a young woman of good family was generally not forced to marry a man she actively disliked. That was real, and it mattered. But do not mistake the freedom to refuse for the freedom to choose. Your field of possible husbands had already been narrowed, drastically before you ever met any of them by everything we have watched this season. Only certain men could reach you at all, filtered by the introductions, by Almacs, by the whole apparatus of exclusion. Your family steered you firmly toward the ones they favored, and away from the ones they did not. Your fortune priced you into a particular market, and out of others. By the time a man was seriously courting you, an enormous amount of choosing had already been done by other people on your behalf, and your remaining freedom was the freedom to say yes or no to a short list drawn up by everyone but you. And when it came to the point, when a man wished to marry you, the real negotiation happened not between the two of you, but between the men of business. This is the part the romance almost never shows, and it is the part that mattered most before any marriage of fortune could go forward. There had to be a settlement, a legal agreement, drawn up by lawyers, hammered out between your father or your guardians and the man who wished to marry you or his family. The settlement determined what happened to the money, how much of your fortune would be tied up for your own protection and your children's, rather than passing entirely into your husband's control and possibly his debts. What you would have to live on if he died before you, the widow's portion. What would come to you in pin money for your own personal spending within the marriage. These were not romantic questions. They were cold, careful, lawyerly questions about property, and they were argued over, sometimes for weeks, because a great deal of money was at stake, and both families were trying to protect their interests. Here is why this mattered so enormously to you, personally, though you might have very little part in the negotiating of it. Remember what we said at the very beginning about married women and property. Under the ordinary law of the time, when you married, your fortune passed into your husband's hands. He controlled it. He could spend it, invest it, waste it, and you had, by default, almost no legal recourse, because in the eyes of the law, your legal person was in some sense absorbed into his. This was the default that a marriage settlement existed to modify. A good settlement, negotiated by a father who cared, and lawyers who were sharp, could carve out protections, could keep part of your fortune in trust, so that a reckless or unlucky husband could not touch the whole of it, could guarantee you an income if you were widowed. A bad settlement, or none at all, left you exposed, so the driest, most legalistic part of the whole courtship, the settlement, was in fact the part that would most shape the actual conditions of the rest of your life. Whether you would have any security of your own, or be entirely dependent on your husband's character and fortune, was decided in those documents by men, while you waited elsewhere in the house. Think about that for a moment, because it is the hard center of everything we have been watching. The entire season, the gowns and the balls and the presentation and Almacs, all of that beautiful, expensive machinery, existed to bring about this transaction. And the transaction, when it came, was conducted largely over your head, about you, concerning what was nominally your money, by men who would then own or manage most of it. You were the most important person in the room, and in the legal sense, one of the least powerful. The fortune that made you desirable was the same fortune you were about to hand over. The independence you appeared to have, as a wealthy young woman courted by many, was about to be exchanged permanently for the dependence of a wife, and yet, and this is where you must hold two things at once again. It was not simply a trap, and the women who lived it did not simply experience it as one. A good marriage was, for a woman of this world, the foundation of a whole life, the source of her home, her status, her children, her sphere of action, running a great household, managing its social life, raising and placing its children, wielding the real, if unofficial, power of an established married woman. All of this was genuine, substantial work, and genuine, substantial life. And much of it was more open to a married woman than to a single one. The married woman who had been, herself, a triumphant heiress in her season, could become, in time, one of the powerful women of society, a hostess whose invitations were sought, even, perhaps, in the fullness of years, one of the very arbiters who decided other girls' fates. The cage had rooms in it, and some of those rooms were large. The question of whether a particular marriage was a good life or a poor one turned enormously on the man, on luck, on the settlement drawn up in those weeks, on things a young woman could influence only at the edges. But the life on the other side of it was a real life, chosen as much as anyone of her sex and time could choose, and it is a failure of imagination, and a small insult to the women who lived it, to see them only as victims of it. So when the man who has been appearing more and more often finally comes to the point and speaks to your father, and the lawyers are set to work, understand what is really being decided, and by whom. A whole future is being negotiated in a lawyer's careful hand. And you, at the center of it, wait to learn the terms of the rest of your life. There is one more thing a young woman brought to her season, alongside her fortune and her face and her fine clothes, and it is the one most easily overlooked, because it was so thoroughly folded into the rest that people forgot it was there at all. She brought her accomplishments. And what those accomplishments were, and what they were for, tells you as much about the position of women in this world as anything we have yet seen. By the time you came out, you had spent years being prepared. Not in the way a young man of your class was prepared, with Latin and Greek, and the expectation of a profession or a seat in Parliament, but in a curriculum designed for exactly one destination, the drawing room. You had very likely learned to play an instrument, the pianoforte above all, or the harp, and to sing a little, and to perform, when asked, for the company. You had learned to draw, or to paint in watercolors, the genteel arts that produced pretty results and demonstrated refinement. You had almost certainly learned some French, and perhaps a little Italian, enough to read, to sing, to sprinkle a phrase into conversation, to show that you were cultivated. You could dance, obviously, and dance well, having been taught by masters. You could do fine needlework. You could carry yourself, move, curtsy, enter a room, all of it trained into you until it looked like nature. These were the accomplishments, and it is easy, from here, to be dismissive of them, to see a list of decorative skills designed to make a young woman ornamental. And there is truth in that, and it was noticed at the time, sharply, by some of the cleverest women of the age, who saw perfectly well that girls were being trained to charm rather than to think, to display rather than to understand, and who said so. The accomplishments were, in large part, a means to an end, and the end was marriage, and the skills were chosen because they made a young woman pleasant to be around and impressive to display, not because they equipped her to act in the world. A young woman who could play a sonata beautifully was demonstrating patience, discipline, refinement, and the leisure to have acquired such a skill, all qualities a man might want in a wife, and the sonata itself, the music, was almost beside the point. But hold on before you dismiss it entirely, because there is another side, and the women who lived it knew both sides. Behind the decorative purpose, real skills were genuinely acquired. A woman who truly learned music, and some did, far beyond the ornamental minimum, had a real art, a source of genuine pleasure and expression that stayed with her for the rest of her life, in a world that offered women very few outlets of any kind. A woman who read seriously, and many did, well beyond what was strictly required, built a real mind, whatever anyone intended, and used it in letters, in conversation, in the raising and teaching of her own children. The accomplishments were a cage, yes, a curriculum designed to shape women for a limited destination. They were also, for a woman with the appetite for it, a set of doors into music and language and art that she could walk further through than anyone had planned. And some women walked very far indeed. And there was the matter of conversation, which sat at the very center of the whole thing, and which we have circled several times, because it deserves to be named directly as the accomplishment above all others. A young woman was expected to converse, and to converse well, and this was harder than it sounds, because the rules of it were exacting and contradictory. She should be informed, but not appear to parade her learning. She should be lively and interesting, but never forward or opinionated in a way that might unsettle. She should be able to discuss the things society discussed, the books, the plays, the news that was fit for a drawing room, but she should defer, gracefully, to the men present, and make them feel clever, and not win an argument too obviously, even when she could. This was an extraordinarily delicate performance, a constant calibration of how much of her own mind to show and how much to veil, and the women who mastered it were doing something genuinely difficult, managing the intelligence they were not supposed to have too much of, deploying it in ways that advanced them rather than alarmed the people whose good opinion they needed. Consider what that cost and what it revealed. A clever young woman in a season had to spend a great deal of energy not on developing her cleverness, but on managing other people's reactions to it, on being just clever enough and no more, on making sure her intelligence read as charm rather than as challenge. The brightest women of the age understood this perfectly, and some of them chafed against it bitterly, and a few of them wrote about it, arguing that women's minds were being deliberately stunted, trained toward ornament and away from substance, so that women would fit the small space the world had allotted them. They were right. And yet the same system produced women of formidable intelligence, precisely because managing all of that constraint was itself an education in human nature, in strategy, in the reading of people and situations, and a woman who came through it had learned things about how power and society actually worked that no schoolroom could have taught her. So when you sit down at the pianoforte in a fashionable drawing room and play the piece you have practiced until your fingers know it without your mind, and the company falls politely quiet to listen, understand what is really happening. You are performing an accomplishment, one of many, that was cultivated in you for a purpose you did not choose, to make you marriageable, to display your family's investment in you, to demonstrate that you are the refined and leisured article the market wants. And you are also, if you have any love for it at all, genuinely making music, genuinely exercising a real skill, genuinely doing something that is yours, in the middle of an evening arranged around everything but you. Both are true. The accomplishment is a cage and a gift, like the gowns, like the season itself, like nearly everything a woman of this world was given. And you play, and it is beautiful, and it is bought. And both of those go on being true, right up until the last note fades, and the polite applause begins. But let us not pretend that every season ended with the right man appearing at the right moment. Most of the young women out in London any given spring did not become engaged that season, and the possibility that you would be one of them, that you would go home in July with nothing settled, hung over the whole undertaking like weather. It is worth sitting with that fear, because it was real, and it shaped how a young woman moved through her spring far more than the romance admits. The season was short. That was the hard fact underneath the anxiety. A few months, essentially, from the filling of the town in early spring to its emptying in the height of summer. And in those few months, the whole thing had, ideally, to be accomplished. A young woman was considered to be at her freshest, her most marriageable, in her first season, when she was new, unseen, an unopened prospect. With each season that passed without a match, a subtle shift occurred. She was no longer new. People had seen her, several springs running, in the same rooms, and the very familiarity that made her comfortable made her, in the cold arithmetic of the market, slightly less valuable. A second season carried a faint shadow of the question, why did she not take the first time? A third season carried it more heavily. There was no fixed cliff, no exact age at which a woman became unmarriageable, and a great fortune could keep a woman in the market long after beauty alone would have carried her out of it. But the pressure of time was real, and every young woman felt it, and her family felt it more, and it lent the pleasant round of balls a current of quiet desperation that the participants worked very hard to hide. Imagine, then, the particular strain of a young woman for whom the season is not going well. The cards are fewer than she hoped. The particular man does not appear, or appears, and drifts away. She watches other girls, her friends, her rivals, become engaged one by one, the announcements coming through the spring, and each one narrows the field and sharpens the sense that she is being left behind. She must go out anyway, every night, and dance, and smile, and appear untroubled, while inside her the fear grows that this expensive, exhausting, meticulously prepared campaign is going to fail, and that she will have to do the whole thing again next year, older, less new, with the question hanging over her. There was real suffering in this, quiet and unspoken and dressed in silk, and it is part of the honest history of the season, as much as the triumphs were. And her family felt the failure as their own, because it was, in a sense, a financial one, as much as a personal one. All that money, the £900 and more, the house, the gowns, the whole outlay, had been spent to achieve a result, and if the result did not come, the money was, in the plainest terms, a poor investment that would have to be made again. This is an ugly way to put it, and no one at the time would have put it so baldly, but it was true, and the young woman at the center knew it was true, and knew that her failure to secure a match was, among other things, costing her family a great deal of money to no purpose. That knowledge sat on top of everything else she carried. Now, let us do something the season itself never did, and turn our attention deliberately to the people who made all of this possible, and who never appear in the story. Go down in your mind from the bright rooms where you are dancing, down the stairs, past the good floors of the house, down to the kitchens and the sculleries and the cramped attic rooms where the servants slept, because your season, every glittering minute of it, rested on their labor, and the contrast between your position and theirs is the last thing we need to see clearly before this spring is over. Consider the maid who dresses you, whom we met at the very beginning. She is perhaps not much older than you, in some cases younger. She rises before you and sleeps after you. Her whole day is arranged around your day. She keeps your enormous wardrobe in order, cleans and mends and presses the gowns, dresses you 4 or 5 times a day, sits up late to undress you when you come home at 3 in the morning, and rises early the next day regardless. She sees you at your worst, and your most tired, and your most human. And she says nothing, because discretion is part of what she is paid for. And she is paid for all of this, something in the region of 15 or 20 pounds a year. Set that beside the 900 pounds your season costs. Set it beside the 200 pound court gown you wore once. Her entire annual wage would not buy a single one of the better dresses she is responsible for. And she has no season. There is no spring in which the machinery of a great family is pointed at securing her a good future. Her future is work, and more work, and if she is fortunate, a decent position in a decent house and a mistress who is not cruel, and perhaps, eventually, marriage to a man of her own class on wages of his own, arranged with none of the ceremony, and none of the settlements, and none of the ostrich feathers. The same institution, marriage, that is being so elaborately arranged for you upstairs, she will come to with almost nothing. No fortune to bring, no lawyers to protect her, no widow's portion negotiated in advance. If she is widowed poor, she is simply poor. The protections you complain of as insufficient are protections she will never have at all. This is not said to make you feel guilty, exactly. You did not build this world, any more than she did. You were both placed in it at different heights, and both of you are doing the work your position demands as well as you can. But the season looks different and truer when you can see the whole house at once, the bright rooms and the cold attics together, and understand that they are not 2 separate stories, but one. The lightness of your evening is built directly on the heaviness of her day. The fortune that makes you a prize is the same system that pays her almost nothing. And the fact that your struggles were real, the exhaustion, the anxiety, the loss of your own property into a husband's hands, does not cancel the fact that hers were harder, and unpaid attention was all they would ever receive, and usually not even that. Hold both of those, the way we have been holding 2 things all along. Your season was genuinely hard, and genuinely a kind of gilded confinement, and also a position of enormous privilege that rested on the labor of women who had nothing like it. all of that is true at once. It was true at the time. It is one of the reasons the season is worth understanding, not as a costume drama, but as a piece of real social history, with real people arranged up and down the whole height of it, each of them living a life they did not entirely choose. And then, quite suddenly, it is nearly over. The season did not fade out slowly. It ended more or less on a schedule, and the schedule was set, as it had been from the beginning, by things far larger than any one young woman's hopes. It ended above all because Parliament ended. When the parliamentary session broke up for the summer, usually somewhere in the height of the warm weather, the men who sat in the two houses were free to leave London, and their families left with them, and the great emptying began. It ended, too, because summer made the city unpleasant, the air close and bad, and because the country called, the estates that had been left to run themselves through the spring, the shooting that would begin in the late summer, the whole other half of the aristocratic year that was lived away from London. By the middle of July, the town was noticeably thinning. By the end of it, the season was, for all practical purposes, done. The good houses closed up. The rented houses were given back. The families dispersed, back to their own counties, or on to the long summer round of visiting one another's country houses, which was its own social world with its own rules, and which was where a great many courtships begun in London were quietly continued, in more comfortable surroundings, at a slower pace. So you pack. The gowns that were made with such care and expense a few months ago are folded away, most of them worn only a handful of times, some of them, like the great court gown, never to be worn again at all. The house that was never yours is handed back to whoever it truly belongs to. The London servants, taken on for the season, are let go, and will find other places or go without, and you will very likely never think of most of them again, and you leave the city that has been the whole of your world for these intense few months, and you go home or onward, carrying whatever the season has given you. What it has given you depends on how it went. Perhaps you go home engaged, the settlement drawn up, the future arranged, a married life waiting on the far side of the summer. Perhaps you go home with an understanding not yet formal, a courtship that will ripen over the country house visits of the autumn. Or perhaps you go home with nothing settled at all, facing the long months until the next spring, and the prospect of doing all of this again, older, with the question a little heavier. In every case, you go home changed. You are not the girl who arrived in February, stiff and cold from the country roads, frightened of a curtsy. You have been presented to a queen. You have danced at Almack's under the eyes of the patronesses. You have learned to read a room, to manage a conversation, to hold friendship and rivalry in the same hand, to perform ease over exhaustion, to move through the most heavily supervised social world imaginable and make it look like freedom. Whatever else the season did or did not accomplish, it made you competent at something genuinely difficult, and that competence is real, and it is yours, and no settlement can sign it away. That is the thing to hold on to at the end, and it is the thing the story usually forgets. The skill was real, everything a young woman learned to do in a season. The social intelligence, the endurance, the self-command, the ability to manage people and occasions and appearances. All of it was genuine capability, hard-won, and often formidable. The women who came through their seasons and went on to run great households and shape society were not decorative. They were skilled operators in the one arena open to them, and they had been trained for it in exactly the school we have just walked through together. And yet, here is the other thing, and we have to hold it at the same time, because holding only the first would be a comfort and a lie. All that skill, all that capability, was developed inside a structure the young woman did not choose and could not change, pointed at an outcome, marriage, after which most of her fortune and much of her legal self would pass into a husband's keeping. She was trained to be brilliant at winning a game whose prize was, in large part, her own dependence. The competence was real, and the cage was real, and the cruelest part was how completely the one was built to serve the other. How the very things that made her impressive were the things that made her marriageable, and marriageable in the end meant handed over. This is not a complaint against any individual woman or any individual man, or even quite against the people who ran it. It is an observation about the structure, the shape of the thing, the way a whole society arranged its daughters' lives. So do not remember the season only as a romance, all candlelight and longing looks, because that version erases the work and the cost, and the women who did the work and paid the cost. And do not remember it only as a cage, all oppression and lost property, because that version erases the skill and the pleasure and the real power some women wrung from it. Remember it as both at once, the way the women who lived it must have felt it on their best and worst nights, gliding across a floor they had every reason to fear, in a dress that cost more than a servant would earn in years, at the center of an evening arranged entirely around them, and not at all for them, brilliant and trapped, and, for these few strange months, more looked at than they would ever be again. The trunk is packed, the feathers are put away, the great gown wrapped in paper against the light. Below you, the house is being closed, sheets thrown over the rented furniture, the fires cold in the grates that were never truly yours. The city outside is emptying, carriage after carriage leaving for the country. The whole bright apparatus of the spring folding itself up for another year. And you sit for a moment in a quiet room at the end of the most important season of your young life, tired all the way down, and let it be over. The candles are out. The dancing is done. The long spring is behind you now, and whatever it decided about your life is decided, or waiting, and there is nothing more to do tonight but rest. So rest. Let the house go quiet around you. Let the season go, and let yourself at last, after all those weeks of being watched, be simply unobserved, and still, and asleep.